When I set out to review a game for the channel, I usually see it through to the end. Even if I'm not loving the experience, I can usually find something that motivates me to keep playing, whether it be an artistic presentation, fun combat, compelling world design, or just a well-told story. There's usually some sort of hook, some beacon of hope that I can look to and say, yeah, that's why I'm playing. Using this approach, in the 6 years I've talked about games, I've never felt so burnt out by a title that I couldn't see it through to the end. That trend ends today though, because Dying Light 2 has zero redeemable qualities, at least to me. After playing the title for over 10 hours, nothing has been able to hold my interest enough to overlook the stagnant world design, the god-awful combat, the overhyped parkour system, the bland characters, or the pointless side content. I've searched so desperately for that hook only to come up empty-handed, so I'm throwing in the towel. I have never felt so turned off by a game that legitimately tried to be good. Now, I would love to create a 2-hour-long project tearing this game apart, but that would require me to see it through to completion, and honestly, even in this downtime, where nothing seems to be releasing, I can't bring myself to do that. Life is too short to put myself through an experience that just isn't working for me. It's not that I hate the game, or that it's completely broken, or anything like that, it just fails to deliver any excitement to me with anything it's trying to do. So while I can't call this a review, since I didn't finish it, I'll instead share my impressions and try to articulate why this game didn't work for me. So with that, this is why I quit Dying Light 2. Stay Human does have an impressive array of systems that generally overlap with one another to build the gameplay experience. However, I use the word impressive loosely, as it refers more to the quantity of the systems rather than their quality. There's combat, a pretty unique day and night cycle, crafting, a detective mode, skill trees, dialogue wheels, inventory management, upgrades, and more. Of course, its most defining trait would be its parkour system that's meant to make traversing the world just as enjoyable, if not more so, than the other elements of the title. Getting from point A to point B in most open world games usually represents downtime for the player to gather themselves and prepare for what awaits them at their destination. That isn't the case here though, as the sheer act of movement is meant to be an engaging part of the experience, so much so that much of the game's content is built around it. Before I talk about my issues with the parkour, I want to make sure that I establish just how vital it is to Dying Light 2. There's no vehicles in this game, meaning that running, jumping, climbing, and swinging are your only options for getting around Villador, the fictional town the game takes place in. The world has been designed with this movement system in mind, as buildings are placed in close proximity with varying heights to allow for a sense of verticality. However, they do look very similar, leading to a lot of repeated views of the same rooftops and ledges. Whenever there is an open area, there's usually some means to traverse the gap to stay above the streets. This includes walking on telephone wires, traversing man-made bridges, or just leaping on street lamps. You're meant to stay off the ground level, as is indicated by the number of ramps leading back up to the rooftops. Still, you can't always manage to do so, and taking to the ground below requires bobbing and weaving through infected. The condensing of the world is what allows for the parkour system to function and to play as important a role as it does. If the world was too spaced out, you wouldn't be able to move through it in the intended way. But if it was too dense, there wouldn't be a challenge, which would defeat the purpose. Because of this, Villador has been designed in a way where the player must keep an active mind as they move, considering their next step while also doing their best to not break stride and keep that sense of flow. Beyond the layout of the world though, a look at the side content reveals further proof of how integral movement is meant to be in the game. Many challenges are built around the parkour system, such as time trials, while many others are fetch quests where the good bit is supposed to come in the form of getting to your destination efficiently. This game boasted about having hundreds of hours of content, and ultimately, much of it comes down to traversal gameplay. With that established, let me just go out and say that if movement was meant to be your defining gameplay experience, then the team really needed to nail it to appeal to a large audience. It needed to click and feel good immediately, as to really hook the player in so that the repetitive content didn't come off that way, because parkour would be so inviting, engaging, responsive, and ultimately fun. In my experience though, it failed to meet this mark, and because so much of the player's enjoyment hinges on their perception of this system, it made me quite bored with this game rather quickly. That's because in the early stages, parkour didn't immediately feel invigorating. Instead, I found myself constantly breaking my flow to look for where to go next, as the camera didn't provide enough of an aerial view to plan my next move with confidence. This often led to me taking leaps of faith as if this was an Assassin's Creed game, only to fall flat on my face and absorb a ton of damage. Descending back to the ground to reach your next quest marker was always a pain because of this, as often the rooftops didn't have an obvious path to the ground that didn't involve fall damage. I'd try to leap onto street lamps and then climb down from there, but I always seemed to take a tick of damage, which felt like a major punishment because of how scarce healing materials can be in this game. It sucked to reach my destination and have to consume health resources before I even started the quest. At the same time, we're playing as a character who has apparently been a nomadic pilgrim for years, meaning his climbing skills ought to be top tier. We're even shown this a bit in the opening cutscene, and he talks about his travels frequently. Yet, this is still a game. The player must start at a baseline and get better, faster, and stronger as the game goes on. It just seems like Aiden should be a better climber from the start than he is, and that it should come more naturally to him, even during the game's opening minutes. It doesn't, and it leads to a disconnect between the player and the player character. Now, as I just mentioned, you can obviously purchase new skills to better your parkour abilities. You earn experience simply by doing things in the game, much like in Skyrim. In other words, if you pull off cool parkour moves, you'll gain parkour experience. It's as simple as that. In my limited time, I turned these points into a handful of abilities, but none of them were sufficient enough to feel like I was making progress as a climber. Of course, I felt this lack of meaningful progression in many areas of the game, including that parkour, but also combat, stamina, and my overall health. As even after playing for 10 or more hours, I was still only level 2 overall, with 3 combat skills and 4 parkour skills unlocked. This drip feed of progression across the board was crippling to my experience, as I never felt like I was pushing myself, my skills, or my character forward in meaningful ways. Anyway, back to those parkour skills I unlocked. I felt that many of them didn't really change up my experience at all. The most notable one allowed Aiden to propel himself forward when leaping over small environmental objects with the massive jump move. I couldn't get it to work most of the time, despite feeling like my inputs were correct. And then there was this one time where I actually did get it to work, but I accidentally launched myself off of a building and took damage because of it, which really dissuaded me from trying it out again. This lack of responsiveness infected much of my time moving around the world, and this lack of consistency in game flow made parkour just something you do, not something you enjoy. And when the game relies so heavily on it to shine, a dull first experience that doesn't progress forward quickly leads to a bored player at best and a frustrated one at most. That's truly the nail in the coffin for me on this game. I didn't like the parkour, and so much of the game's content immediately felt like a slog. That wasn't the only issue I had with Dying Light 2, as combat failed to impress me either. We have a first-person action melee setup here, where the player can dodge, parry, and strike back with weapons that degrade in the same way as swords in Breath of the Wild. Enemies are free to attack you from any direction at any time, so you're meant to stay limber on the battlefield, which does tie back into the parkour system, which was a thoughtful inclusion. Positioning yourself is vital in overcoming a battle without taking too much damage, but I often found this difficult for a few reasons. First and foremost, the earliest combat skill is a leap maneuver that allows you to jump over staggered enemies and dropkick another one nearby. For the life of me, I could not get this to work like 95% of the time. Maybe I'm just bad, that's definitely a distinct possibility, but the parry window seemed so off to me that I could never stagger enemies and pull off this sick maneuver. I would just end up either taking damage or mistiming it and tried climbing over enemies, which looked really stupid, and then often I would just die. And it dissuaded me from trying it out anymore. So instead, it became a game of back up towards the wall, keep all the enemies in front, and flail about madly until they were all dead. Combat feels so slow while playing this way, but it was the only way I could avoid death and having to go back pretty far due to the game's sometimes ungenerous checkpoint system. Another reason it felt sluggish is because enemies have a ton of health in this game. It can take like 6, 7, or 8 swings from your crudely cobbled together weapon to secure a kill. It feels weird when you slash a human enemy with a giant sword only to see them stumble and then come right back at you. There's a disconnect there, because we know any human would be severely wounded from just one strike. A lot of games find a way to get around this, whether it be distancing the player and the camera and their viewpoint from the action, or doing it through visuals, or doing it through animations, or whatever, but the proximity between you and your enemy makes it unavoidable in Dying Light 2. It just feels like you hit them once and they should be dead. They're humans, they can't take a massive slash to the face and then just keep going. Also, there's only 2 types of enemies, meaning that variety isn't even a factor that can elevate this combat system. The result is a repetitive and overly long set of combat slogs that just fail to excite, unless you're able to pull off that dropkick consistently. And even if you do manage to do that, I have to imagine seeing that animation over and over would get stale quickly too. They've built a combat system here, but haven't done anything with it to make it feel unique or fun. Different weapons, modifications for them, armor loadouts, new skills, and more all failed to deliver anything of substance that would make fighting enjoyable. In a way, it feels like they settled for the bare minimum and then tried dressing it up with other things instead of providing a solid starting foundation. So yeah, parkour and combat did not click for me for the reasons that I've outlined here. But even with these 2 huge body blows to the game, more jabs can be taken at it with little defense. Side quests are terrible in this game. At least most of the ones that I experienced. The very first one I found was this man here, who proceeded to tell me about how important fish were to him. He spoke of a gentle nature and their immense knowledge, and how he was sad that many of his fish had died due to a lack of clean water. I didn't really know where the game was going with all of this as I sat there listening, but apparently the answer was nowhere. Talking to him starts and ends the quest. You don't do anything. It's not even like this conversation provides a cool tidbit about the state of the city or its backstory. it's just a guy talking about fish. That's it. On the other end of the spectrum, the only good one I found, of which I did about a dozen I'd say, was this one, where you're tasked by a mobster to check up on one of his guys. You meet up with the subordinate only to find out that he's broken his ankle and is unable to collect the valuable loot in a nearby building to give to the mobster. He tells you about how the mafia boss has a huge influence over the villa, and how he's basically just a rat stuck in a cage. He's under the foot of that mobster, and he's in too deep. He needs the money, but hates the work. Anyway, you come to recover the resources for him, but are jumped by some local goons. You can kill or run away from them, but returning to the hobbled man, you come to learn more. He tells you the men who jumped you were actually working with him, and that he was planning to keep this stash of goods for himself. He compels you not to tell the mobster, and his fate is let up to you. You can report him, or you can cover for him. I decided to cover for him, but the game had a cool twist, where the mobster was actually working with the guys who jumped me as well. I didn't see it coming, and I was actually like, oh, a side quest did something neat for once. The gameplay was still weak, but at least this twist at the very end was cool. That's it for good side content that I experienced. Many others I played were either fetch quests where I had to parkour to an area to pick something up for someone, or time trials disguised as side quests because of a small dash of flavor context. For instance, here's a guy. He wanted me to deliver his shitty cooking that was going bad and rancid as quickly as possible so that the guests would consume it before it got too disgusting. Like, what a terrible setup, first of all. I'm not sure if it's supposed to be funny or what, but it just isn't. I mean, food poisoning isn't a joke, Jim. Millions of families suffer every year. Anyway, the point is, don't take the promise of a side quest and slap it on a time trial if that's not what it actually is. There's also buildings to loot. Yup, that's considered side content in this game. There's buildings you can go into for extra materials and supplies. Some of them contain inhibitors that can be used to upgrade health or stamina, although it takes 3 inhibitors to get 1 upgrade, which further restricts the sense of progression. There's infected or mean humans in there too, so be sure to watch out for them. That's literally it. Dozens of these dot the map. Going hand in hand with that are the windmills, that are basically watchtowers from any Ubisoft game. You climb to the top, and it unlocks a safe zone where the player can rest, check on their stash, and most importantly, recover their humanity to stay human during the night. And you know what? That makes for a good moment to transition again. Perhaps the most interesting thing in Dying Light 2 is its implementation of a day and night cycle that's meant to have a tangible effect on the world. During the day, the streets are much less crowded with infected, but lootable shops will be packed with extra zombies as a result. At the same time, your character, who is also infected, doesn't have to worry about turning into a zombie during the day. That's because the ultraviolet rays from the sun keep the sickness at bay. However, at nighttime, the player isn't afforded that same luxury. At night, more zombies roam the streets, but you're safer when exploring those lootable buildings. However, you have to be careful because without the sun, those ultraviolet rays aren't able to help you out. To prevent turning, you'll have to consistently dip into areas with man-made UV lights to ward off the infection. So why play at night then? Well, you gain more experience while venturing out in the dark, which is a nice way to incentivize the player to engage this harder difficulty. It's a decent setup on paper, but personally, its implementation ended up being rather lackluster because the systems around it already dragged down the experience too heavily. On top of that, I also found some very wonky interactions while playing at night. Sure, some quests are only available then, which is cool, but I found that the meshing of this structured content with the other basic exploration content was janky at times. There was an instance in which I was being chased through the open world. This meant that the zombies had found me and were in hot pursuit. They move really slow usually, so the whole chase thing is weird since the workaround is to literally just spawn them from inside of buildings directly in front of your path as if they are omnipotent. So yeah, that's weird and stupid. But anyway, I reached my destination, a main quest only completable at night. I entered the building it began in, but the chase from outside didn't end. The zombies in there hilariously became alerted to me immediately, and despite no other infected being able to enter the building, I couldn't progress the quest until the chase ended. Meanwhile, my chase meter kept going up. So I left. I went back to a safe house and waited for the chase to end when the zombies perished to the UV rays. Well, as soon as I left the safe area, the chase immediately began again, despite not having any zombies near me. But then, as soon as that chase started up again, bam, the zombies spawned in. Like, it was so stupid. I repeated this 3 times before accepting that the only way to make this quest work was to rest at a bed twice. Once to reach daytime, and once to reach the next nighttime to reset the cycle. This finally worked, but it took me on a 10-minute detour when all I wanted to do was start the next quest. That was annoying, and it made me wonder if the day and night cycle was as good as it was cracked up to be. Pressing onward though, and another thing about the world design that really irked me was its lack of continuity. There were a handful of times throughout the game where characters seemed to teleport. For instance, there's these forced cutscenes where you come face to face with a story character and they give you a speech about something and then they walk off the screen and you resume control. But the second you get that control back, they are often gone and out of sight completely. It's very strange. There was also a moment where a character commented on the events of the day prior, despite the fact that I had slept through 4 day and night cycles between these 2 quests. It's a break in continuity between the story quests and the player taking time to do side content. The game couldn't account for me doing that, and I could, so it just seemed off. I'm like, no, that wasn't yesterday, that was like 4 days ago in-game. But this guy didn't realize that. Other times, characters will send you out in search of someone or something, and when you find it, they've already moved to a location on the other side of the map. For instance, in the main mission I was just complaining about with the chase, a man sends you to find his friend. When you find the friend, he shares his dying words with you, but when you report back to the man, he's already back at the bazaar, this community's headquarters. You come to find out that he went back there as soon as you found out that his friend had died, but there's so little time between these moments, where the man dies and he radios in to tell you he's back at the bazaar, that it seems impossible for him to have traveled that distance so quickly. There were a lot of moments like this, and it sucked me right out of the world. Of course, the story itself really failed to engage me either. This game tells the story of Aiden, a pilgrim who makes his way to Villador in search of his long-lost sister Mia, or Mai. It's one of those two, I can't really remember anymore. As kids, the two were experimented on by an evil doctor, and it seems that returning to where it all started is Aiden's best chance to find his sister. Finding her proves to be very difficult, as Aiden quickly gets wrapped up in the politics of this isolated city and its inhabitants. I have 3 problems here with the story. 1, Aiden seems to get really emotionally invested into the lives of these people despite simply being here to find his sister. 2, the player's motivation to do side content clashes with Aiden's drive to once again find his sister. And 3, the character building and writing are extremely shallow and uninspired. So let's go into a little bit more detail about these. Aiden goes down a rabbit hole of quests that all begin with his goal of finding the sister. However, each new quest seems to send him to a different NPC who needs his help with something completely different. It all keeps diluting the experience until it eventually feels like Aiden is here to save the people of the bazaar or to locate the murderer of a peacekeeper captain instead of saving his own flesh and blood. I kept having these moments where I was like, what is going on? Why am I doing all of this again? And then I'd be like, oh yeah, I need to find Barney's friend so that Barney will go back to the bazaar so that that'll help Sophie, so that she will trust me, so that she might tell me info about who killed the peacekeeper captain, so that I can tell the new PK leader who did it, so that he will allow me to access to the inner city, so that maybe I can find Sophie. Wait, Mia. See, it's confusing. It's a lot of steps, and the farther you go down, the more purposeless it feels. You lose track of why you're doing what you're doing, because they just keep sending you to somebody new, and you don't feel like you're getting anywhere. And it's not like these additional adventures provide any sort of substance on their own. We have some decent world building here between the factions of the city, but these community-wide clashes aren't meshed with memorable characters or interesting stories to make it feel worthwhile. Not a single character in this game was exciting to me. All of them felt boring, generic, stereotypical, or archetypical. And your interaction with them is extremely limited, as none of them ever accompany you after sending you out to do their bidding. This makes sense given the movement system and that emphasis on the style of individual parkour, but truly it leaves every character feeling shallow. Your interactions with them are so limited, and often they don't have a whole lot to say. They dress up these conversations with cutscenes and dialogue options, but just nothing that captivates. The writing is very boring, standard, emotionless, and the voice acting suffers as a result too, as it all feels very disjointed and tonally inconsistent at times. I mean, I haven't seen writing this dull in zombie media since the second season of The Walking Dead. It just did not blend well together at all, leading to a very forgettable and perplexing direction for this story to go in. Finally, well, I guess I don't mind this game's art direction at times. I think many of the game's models and texture work are lacking though, especially now that we are a year and a half into this console generation. The game didn't look particularly good to me, and I found the sound effects and music to be quite lacking as well. It was just alright, it was passable, but it was yet another element that failed to elevate this game past mediocrity. And ultimately, I think that's what Dying Light 2 is. A mediocre game worthy of the 4.9 score it has on Metacritic from fans. In some ways, it feels like a very ambitious title that wanted to accomplish a lot, but it failed to deliver a home run on any of them. The parkour system starts off too flat and doesn't get much better in a hurry, and since much of the content relies on its success, much of the content also suffers. Combat is very bog standard and repetitive without much room for player expression or cool scenarios to play out. The day and night cycle feels underutilized and frustrating at times. And the story is a stinker. Also, there's apparently co-op in this game too, but I hear it's pretty rough as well. I can see how some folks will enjoy this game, but I have to imagine that most of them will be in the minority, and very few will call this a favorite of theirs upon reflection. This feels like a game that needed to rein things back and focus on making its core principles, that parkour and the combat, a much better experience than they ended up being. Once those foundations were solid, the rest could have been built on top. But as it is now, Dying Light 2 feels like a hodgepodge of every open world game trope of the last few years, done without any of the polish or distinguishing features that masterpieces of this genre employ wonderfully. This game will always have that meme surrounding it too, where the developers claimed it took 500 hours to do everything in the game. Well, let me tell you, 500 hours? That sounds like hell. Thanks for watching. Alright, wrapping things up here. Yeah, I had a lot of hope going into this game that I'd find it enjoyable. Maybe perhaps kind of standard for an open world game. But honestly, if that hope was a guiding light, it went ahead and did exactly what the title of this game suggests. It died. Anyway, if you're new to the channel, I'd ask for you to go ahead and subscribe if you enjoyed what you saw here. I've been saying this in nearly every video lately, but I'm trying to get to 1,000 subscribers, and I really want to accomplish that goal by the end of 2022. So go ahead and click the button, turn those notifications on, and then I welcome you to our tiny community. If you want to see a review for a good open world game, you can check out my videos on Horizon Forbidden West and Elden Ring for more. Anyway, as always guys, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing for more, follow me on Twitter at NopNapNarp, and as always, have a nice day and take care.